So if I had my screen up, it would say welcome. In the interest of time, we're not going to do all the introductions right away. We'll try to save that to the end. And we have a special guest, Marshall Ganz. Most of you probably have heard of him. I have heard of him, but only met him recently. And so I can't tell you an awful lot about his history, but I've read some stuff, and without getting into all that, we've been corresponding a little bit and discussing this kind of work. He obviously has a long history of trying to teach people how to teach social action, which is kind of the goal we have. And in our most recent conversation, he joined the last webinar, said that he'd like to do one on public narrative, talk about that with our group and share some of his perspective and that approach in his teaching. So this is, as I saw with my invitation, he's actually teaches a whole course on this with a primary focus. So this is sort of I'm assuming kind of a primer. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Marshall. And what I'm going to try to do is carve out maybe 10 minutes at the end, and I'll give Marshall a 5-minute warning. If it's going strong, I might squeeze our time into 5 minutes. We can do our updates in a little less time. But I think that's kind of the plan this afternoon. So Marshall, go ahead.
Bobby, there's one thing. For some reason, I seem to have lost everybody's view.
Oh, yeah. So you can't see them. That's probably because you're full screen. So if you go escape, you can go less full screen.
I think I am less than full screen.
All right. Yeah. Well, why don't you just go ahead? Because it only lets you see a small number of the people anyway.
No, but I do need to see the people.
Okay. So then why don't I do this? Why don't I take over the screen and I'll run your PowerPoint? Because it might take us the next 10 minutes to figure that out.
That's cool. That'd be terrific.
All right, let me just do that. And so here's the stuff on public narrative. Now, do you see people's faces now, Marshall?
Yeah, good. Now I've got gallery view. Yeah.
Great. And I'll scroll through it. You just say next slide.
Cool. Very good. I think I can manage that. That's great. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Scott, and everybody for this opportunity to share this public narrative work we've been doing. I'll just say my introduction. I became interested in narrative, first by growing up in a tradition in which the story is a more central part of your identity than place. Jewish tradition is that, because it's sort of, you live in a narrative. Everything celebrates that. When I became an organizer, got involved in the civil rights movement first, and then with the farm workers for 16 years in California, I found myself in movements that were rooted in narratives, often faith narratives, or faith narratives interacting with sort of cultural social justice narratives. But the whole significance of narrative as a source of motivation, of solidarity, of courage, was a major part of those movements. Now, when I came back to school and began working on my dissertation in strategy, I kept coming back to this question about motivation. And let me put it this way. When I was working with the farm workers, our strategy was always a critical question, because we were always David trying to deal with Goliath. And when you're David trying to deal with Goliath, you have to compensate for institutional resources you don't have with greater resourcefulness, with greater creativity. And so that was always important. But if you had a great strategy and nobody showed up, you wouldn't have such a great strategy, especially if your power depended on your people. And so this relationship between strategy and motivation was really central to our whole reality. And when I left the farm workers, if we were doing a campaign, we would always have a story, which was about the motivation, a strategy, which is about the how, why, how, and then a structure. How do we organize ourselves to carry out that strategy on behalf of that story? Now, when it comes to, so I came to developing this public narrative work while I was teaching at the Kennedy School, mainly because I wanted to catch up with this motivation piece. And I was doing it in the context of teaching organizing. And so I want to back up for a moment and just share the approach that we take to organizing so we can see where narrative fits into that. And then we'll dig more specifically into the narrative. Next slide. Awesome. The approach to, next slide, yeah. Oh, there. The approach that I take to teaching leadership is rooted in 3 questions posed by a first-century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who, when asked, how do I figure out what to do with my life, responded with 3 questions to ask yourself. And the first question was, ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Not meant to be a selfish question, but a self-regarding question. In other words, if you presume to lead, then you better be clear about what you expect to it, bring from it, and have enough self-awareness that you're actually able to see others. Because the second question is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be who, a human being, and not a what thing, is to recognize we exist in relationship with others in the world. Our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but a caution against what Jane Addams called the snare of preparation. Just another year of strategic planning, we'll have the perfect plan, we'll go out and implement it, and the world will totally conform, except it never does. Or around here, it's just a graduate degree, and I'll have all the answers to the world's problems, and that turns out not to be so accurate either. The point is that rarely can we learn to do well what we want to do until we actually begin to do it. In other words, that understanding flows from action rather than preceding it. Now, for me, leadership is about the interaction of those 3 elements, about self, with other, with action. And the fact that they're questions is also important because he's not the answer man. He poses questions back. Because if you think about what the domain of leadership really is, maybe you've had the experience when everything is going really, really well, and people say, where's the leadership so we can thank them? When do people say who's in charge here? When?
When it's not working.
When do they say, where's the leadership? See, when everything's working fine, the system's working. What do you need leadership for? The system's working. It's the challenges, the contradictions, the dilemmas, the nuance that the system is not addressing that requires the adaptive practice of leadership, because leadership is an adaptive and creative kind of practice. And to acknowledge that you're entering into a domain where control will simply never exist is challenging, because you ask yourself, next slide, you ask yourself, do I have the skills that I need to deal with these new challenges? And that's a challenge to the hands. Can I use my resources in new ways? And that's a strategic challenge, a challenge to the head. And then there's, where do I get the hope? Where do I get the courage? How do I inspire the hope and courage in others that it takes to take the risks that are often involved in dealing with real challenges? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's a way of thinking of leadership in a head, hands, heart kind of way. And so the definition, next slide, that I've come to use for leadership is this, that it is about accepting responsibility. That is, there is a choice, but it's accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose. This is not a diva model of leadership. This is not leader as the great wise face in the sky that tells us what to do. This is a form of social interaction around the accomplishment of shared effort under conditions of uncertainty. And introducing leadership that way, it makes it much more of a practice, a way of doing things, than a position, because we've all had experience with people who occupy formal positions of leadership who turn out to be pretty awful leaders. I think we're getting lessons in that every day today. But we also meet people in neighborhoods and communities, in schools who are exercising leadership in the way I'm describing it all the time, but without the titles and without the formal designation. So it's distinguishing then leadership as a practice, not a position, not even a particular person necessarily, but a way of doing things, a kind of practice. And organizing then, next slide, for me is a particular form of leadership, a form of leadership that begins by asking not what's my issue, but who are my people? Who is the community with whom I'm engaging in this relationship? Because this is a relational notion of leadership. It's not performative. In other words, I'm not performing for an audience, I'm entering into relationship with people. And what are the challenges they experience in terms of their own lives? And what would change look like in a real way? So what is the change that they want and need? And finally, how can I work with them to enable them to turn their resources into the power they need to accomplish the change? So this is working with people not as clients for not as services for clients, not as marketing products to customers, fine thing, not organizing. It's about bringing people together to form a constituency, which comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. In other words, to bring people together, to stand together, learn together, decide together, act together, and hopefully win together. So that's the sort of basic approach. And when we teach the full organizing program, we focus on 5 practices of relationship building, storytelling, strategizing, structuring, and action. Sort of core practices, micro practices. I think of them as micro practices that enable macro accomplishment. People sometimes want to go right to the macro and forget about the micro. It's like trying to compose a symphony without knowing how to read music. It doesn't work. Now, narrative comes into the picture because it turns out that narrative is one of the fundamental ways in which we've learned to access the emotional resources embedded in our values for the sources of courage to respond to, how can I say, to have the emotional resources to avoid reacting to threats with fear, but embrace challenges with hope. In other words, create the conditions for agency and for the exercise of agency. And in public narrative and teaching narrative as a leadership practice or an organizing practice, then we built it around those 3 Hillel questions. How can I tell my story in such a way that you can get me, what we call a story of self? How can we share our story in such a way that we get each other? And how can we turn the current moment into a narrative moment in which we confront a challenge, we find a source of hope, and we have to make choices about how to move forward and how to act. So we're going to spell this out a little more, but I want to go back now to the next slide, which is that distinction between strategy and narrative, or cognition and emotion. And when I came back to school, I was, like I say, I was interested in this dynamic. And actually, when I was working my PhD, I also wandered into a seminar, graduate seminar with a Jungian psychologist called the Neurophysiology of Myth. And it turned out to be a really cool thing to understand how the way stories work interact with the way the brain works. But when I came back to school, I discovered that Jerome Bruner, in particular, at the Ed School, had been doing a lot of work, cultural psychologists, on understanding these distinct domains of meaning making. And one is based on the notion that we map the world cognitively, where things are in relationship to each other, where this is, that is, and so forth, which is crucial for being able to answer the question, how do I get from here to there? And that seems to be the domain of strategy. Now, there's a second kind of mapping that we do of the world, and that's an emotional or affective mapping of the world. In fact, it's a mapping in which we attach value to the people, objects, experiences of the world. What inspires me? What discourages me? What causes me despair? what disgusts me, what lifts me up. And it's that second domain, that domain of emotional mapping, which is where we go to answer the question, why? Why do I care? Why should anybody care? And so it turns out that that domain of emotion is really where the work of narrative is being done. And it's an answer to the why question. Whereas the domain of cognition is where the strategic work is being done. Now, obviously, in reality, they're not so distinct, but it's important to appreciate the role. You can think of it as head and heart in action in the hands, because you don't get to action without motivation. St. Augustine wrote it, he says, one thing to know the good, another to love it, and loving it is what enables action upon it. That knowledge does not turn into action by itself. An important, very important thing to remember. Now, if you go to the next slide, what this means is that if we're going to really talk about values with any seriousness, it's not simply an intellectual conversation. It's not a bunch of ideas that go up on the wall on a mission statement and then we're done. If we're going to talk about values, we need to speak in the language in which values exist, because values are that which actually moves us, like St. Augustine's saying. Not the word, but what actually moves us. We confront a choice, what moves us? And that language is the language of emotion. Now, it may sound weird to say language of emotion because, emotion's crazy irrationality, right? We got to get that out of the picture. Well, you get that out of the picture, you can get human beings out of the picture. You're going to be left with economic models or something like that. Because when you think about it, we all speak the language of emotion. I mean, how about music? Music is all about the language of emotion. The most plastic, no words. What about prayer? What about theater? What about poetry? Well, narrative is in that domain. It's in that domain of learning to speak the language of emotion. And it's interesting because Martha Nussbaum, in Unsettled Thoughts, writes about research on people with damaged amygdalas who can't experience emotion very much. And they can reason options to a problem, many options, but you know what they can't do? What do you think they cannot do? I'm not hearing anything. You got a problem. They can come up with options, something they can't do.
Can't decide.
Can't decide because decisions rest on value judgments, and value judgments require emotional information. In other words, emotional information is about the meaning of the world in so many different ways, even as cognitive information is about how to operate within that. Now, when it comes to leadership and organizing, can you skip to the slide after next? They're a little out of order. Yeah, next slide. The thing is that most of the time that we operate based on habit. It's very efficient. We don't have to learn how to redrive the car every time we get in it, and it's great. But one day I'm driving along and a truck pulls out in front of my car and I stay on autopilot and it's no longer okay. Our brains have developed what's called a surveillance system that detects anomalies. And so we're driving along and up pulls a truck and my brain is going truck, truck, truck. Now I experience that as anxiety. And the anxiety I experience actually can be very positive because it's calling my attention to the fact this is not business as usual. This requires something different because we are so skilled at screening out data that differs with what we already believe. And we know how that works, confirmation bias, whatever we want to call it. But so when there's something really different, we have to pay attention in a different way. And in organizing, you're often confronted with that problem. I mean, the climate change movement has that problem big time, where people just want to stay in habit. And so on the left, you see their inertia and apathy sort of representing habit. So how do we break habit? Well, one way is by creating urgency. You know, we all know the meaning of urgency. You know, I have a, I have to decide about my career as a student, but I have a problem set the next day. Well, what am I going to do? I'll do the problem set, because urgency is an expression of priority. Urgency is what gives priority. And the challenge often in organizing is how to make the important urgent. And that's been the big challenge of the climate change movement, has been how to make the important urgent. Mm-hmm. So urgency, deadline, we have deadlines, that's why we have 3 days left until whatever and so forth. But also anger. And by anger, I don't mean rage, I mean outrage. I mean the dissonance we experience when we encounter a contradiction between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. Like putting kids in cages down on the border. And people say, outrageous. Yes, it is outrageous. And that outrage can be an important source of courage. And that's what I mean by anger. So there are ways to break through the inertia and the apathy, but then the problem is, what do we do with that? And the problem is that anxiety often quickly morphs into something else. The something else it morphs into, I see some heads nodding there. What's it being morphed into? Yeah. I don't know. Huh? I'm sorry, say that again.
Fear?
Well, to be overwhelmed, it often morphs into fear. You know, and we're hardwired for fear because, you know, we have a negative bias anyway, and we're hardwired into fear, I mean, because back when we were, you know, dealing with saber-toothed tigers, it was a pretty good idea to respond to a saber-toothed tiger with flight or maybe freeze. I don't know about fight, but we're hardwired for that response to threat. Now, the problem is that when we begin to live in communities with other people, to react fearfully to novelty, to the unexpected, to the surprising, becomes deeply counterproductive. And so we began to do the cultural work necessary to figure out how to manage our fear, how to manage our hearts. And so we learned how to access sources of hope to counter fear. And by hope, I don't mean flowers in May, everything's hunky-dory. I mean, well, Maimonides had a definition, which was hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible, as opposed to the necessity of the probable. In other words, to be a realist is to recognize that it is always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. It was improbable we would elect a black man president of this country in 2007. It happened. And it's that sense of possibility that's precious. How to counter the isolation that goes with fear with solidarity or love. How to counter the self-doubt that goes with fear with ICMAD. What's ICMAD? ICMAD?
Make a difference.
You can make a difference. Yeah. And you can make a difference. So it's self-efficacy, but it's specifically you can make a difference. And so on the one hand, the challenge is, sometimes the challenge is to create the challenge, and other time, and all the time though, it's to create the capacity to respond to the challenge, not with fear, but with hope. And that's kind of at the heart of a lot of the challenges that we face in this kind of work. Now, what does it have to do with narrative? Let's go to the next slide, Bob. The next slide is that stories all have three elements. They all have a plot, a character, and a moral. And so what does it take to make a plot a plot? Well, I got up this morning, I prepared for this presentation, and I began to talk. Pretty exciting, right? You want to find out what happened next? What would it take to make it a plot?
Something else interfered.
Huh? Something interfered, like what?
Like technology.
Oh boy. And then the techno gods, the techno demons beset us. And here we are trying to do this thing right. And the techno demons keep putting up obstacles, and everybody's waiting. And then swooping out of the sky comes with a cape Bobby with his technological solutions and redeems us from our problem. The point is that we all recognize that it's only when disruption occurs that our interest is generated. Up to that point, it's boring. And so then the question to ask is, why is that so compelling? Why, when the disruption occurs, yeah, what's going to happen? What do you think? Why is that so compelling? I mean, we spend billions of dollars on basically the same thing in movies and plays and songs. And why is it so compelling?
Creates a need to know and an opportunity to act on that, to engage your mind and possibly actions with something.
Okay, yeah, it could create that, but why is it so compelling? In other words, what's at stake? What's at stake?
Curiosity.
Right, curiosity. But why the curiosity? What are you curious about? What's sparking your curiosity? And people say, well, I want to know what happened. Well, why do you care what happened? I mean, think about it this way for a moment. How many times a day does the unexpected happen to you that you have to deal with? In little ways. I mean, you know, the movie's sold out of tickets, there's no parking place or whatever. And then there's the big things. People lose jobs, marriages break up. We lose loved ones for whom we care, for which almost by definition we cannot be prepared. Isn't it the case that a fundamental dimension of human consciousness and experience is having to cope with that for which we are not prepared? And we seem infinitely curious to learn how. Not in a tactical way, not like, how do I, you know, fix the tire on the car? But it's more like, wait a second, how is that dealt with? How is that addressed? Where did the courage come from? And that's where the protagonist comes in, because we can identify with the protagonist, and we understand now through the process of mirror neurons that when we observe the action of another, we can actually experience elements of that action as if it were our own. And so when we identify with the protagonist in a story, we actually feel some of the fear. We also feel the hope. We may experience the isolation, but we can also experience the solidarity. In other words, we have access to the values resources on which the protagonist is drawing to cope with the challenge that they face. And so the moral that we walk away with is not a saying like haste makes waste, it's the actual experience of haste having made waste. And so the moral is much more to the heart than to the head. It is a way it is a form of emotional learning, is what occurs. And if you think about it, you know, where'd you hear all your stories? Where'd you hear all your stories? From who? United Storytellers Guild? Come on. Who told you the stories? You have kids, you tell them stories?
You can go back that far.
Parents,
Teachers. Yeah. But so why are they telling you all those stories? What's the motivation?
Yeah.
But they may be trying to keep you busy, and that's possible, but what else?
teach a moral lesson.
Teach morals and values, yeah.
Yeah, instruction, right? So then you say, okay, well then why not just give them a list? Do this, don't do this. Right? That's fine. Hey, I'll give you the information. You got it, right?
It's not as effective.
Yeah, because the problem is that it all assumes cognition is how all this stuff works, and not emotion. Because when you tell the story, then they're getting it, and they're getting the source. Bruner saw that 85% of the time parents spend with young children is in storytelling, and he described it as agency lessons, or in other words, how to become choiceful human beings through storytelling. And like, for example, everybody's got a story like, let me tell you about Uncle Charlie. You know, Uncle Charlie started out great, right? He had everything going for him. Then he took a wrong turn, and you don't want to be like Uncle Charlie. So let me tell you about Aunt Harriet. Now, she had it right. All over the world, families tell those stories. And they tell about Uncle Charlie and Aunt Harriet. Our faith traditions all teach through stories. Our cultures all teach through stories. So it's a fundamental way of teaching and learning how to exercise agency, how to find the emotional resources to exercise choice. And in public narrative, then we're harnessing the power of narrative to the work of leadership by learning how to use narrative to communicate to others why I've been called to what I've been called to. Not my resume, not my titles, but my calling. And the thing about it is, you know, all of us have a rich repertoire of narratives on which to draw. Because our lives, we've learned through stories too, stories that we've lived through, that we've lived. If you think the basic element of the story is the moment, and a narrative moment is a moment in which a protagonist is confronted with a challenge, a choice is required, and an outcome results. That's the basic unit of narrative. I show my class 6 minutes of Michelle Obama and 6 minutes of Hillary Clinton from the Democratic Convention. And Michelle Obama speaks all in narrative moments. See, a narrative moment brings the past into the present. It's a present tense moment. It brings the distant into the immediate. And so Michelle Obama, she's saying, in the morning, the big black cars arrive to pick up the kids, these guys with guns, and their two daughters are with their faces pressed up against the window. She turns to Barack, says, "What have we done?" At the end, she talks about waking up in a White House in a house built by slaves, but seeing her beautiful black daughters playing on the lawn. These are moments. And because they're moments, she becomes emotionally present. And because she becomes emotionally present, we not only get the moment, but we get her. Hillary could never tell a story. And there's plenty of good reasons for her walls. But the problem is, by walling herself in, she also walled everybody out. And that's a real challenge. Because to communicate, and see, the thing is that we have these experiences. Often we learn what we care for when it hurts. And it can be painful. But those moments are powerful moments. And sometimes, and always, also, almost always, we also learn our hope the same way. I mean, we all have these stories of hurt, or we wouldn't think the world needed fixing. And if we didn't have stories of hope, we wouldn't think we could do anything about it. And so we have within our own lives the repertoire on which to call for telling a story of self. The story of us is about bringing a live experience shared by those whom we're engaging that lift up values that we share. It's not a categorical us like everybody with brown hair. It's an experiential us. It's the kind of us Dr. King created at the March on Washington. It's that kind of us. And then, what about now? The story of now is to turn the current moment into a moment in which we confront an urgent challenge. We find a source of hope. And there are choices we can make to deal with that challenge. So we're going to look at this video now as an example. This is a 5-minute public narrative by one of my students, James Croft, from a number of years ago. And in the class that I teach, the first part, they learn to tell their public narrative, their story of self now. In the second part, they learn how to use narrative to deal with challenges like loss and change and difference and power. So they make this 5-minute video in which they link a story of self, us, and now. So as you watch this, first of all, ask yourself, when is he telling a story of self? When is he telling a story of us? And when is he telling a story of now? Second, what are the moments? Why does he choose the moments that he chooses? Third, why all the details? And fourth, what are the values that you experience through this narrative as being salient and important? Okay, let's take a look.
Everybody can see it, right? Everybody got there on the screen?
Wow, that was 6.12 seconds. That's about how long it takes to fall 604 feet. And 604 feet is about how far Tyler Clementi fell after he jumped off the George Washington Bridge. Now, as we know, he took his own life because live video footage of him having a romantic encounter with another man was streamed live on the internet by his college roommate. Just one of a very long list of young people who have taken their lives because of anti-LGBT bullying in the past few weeks. Now, I never experienced anything like what Tyler went through when I was at school, but I was bullied for being gay. You see, when I was a kid, I was a ballet dancer. And every week I squeezed into a leotard and blue shiny hot pants. It was quite an outfit. And I spent an evening practicing demi-pieds and pirouettes. And I loved it. I loved the discipline. The music played on the old piano. The feel of the wood beneath my feet. I even secretly quite liked the outfit. But my schoolmates and some of my teachers didn't like ballet as much as I did. And one of my teachers, a PE teacher, used to make fun of me. He used to say how girly I was, how dancing is not something that boys should do. I remember the sneer on his face as I walked past, and I remember he was the first person to call me a fag, which at 7 years old, I didn't really understand. I remember in high school how gay was only ever used as a term of abuse. And I remember one cold morning sitting in assembly while the principal intoned, "Homosexuals deserve our pity and our prayers." And I sat among hundreds of other boys thinking I was all alone in the world, that I was the only one who had this problem. Now, not everyone there experienced something like that, but we all know, I think, what it means to feel alone, to feel like there's no one on our side. Perhaps you were too tall and the short kids made fun of you. Or perhaps you were too short and you got it from the taller ones. Or perhaps you were too smart or too dumb, or from the wrong side of town, or the wrong race. We all know, I think, even if just for a moment, what it feels like to think that there's no one on your side, to think that no one has your back. And all of us, if there are young people in our lives that we care about, can agree that we don't want this to happen to them. Imagine, if you can, what it must be like to come home and see a strange shape hanging from a tree in your backyard, twisting in the wind, the creak of the branch as it bends beneath the weight, and that feeling in your gut as you get closer and you realize what it is hanging there, who it is, who it was. Because that was Seth Walsh, 13, who hung himself from a tree in his backyard. It was Billy Lucas who hung himself at his grandmother's house. And it was Raymond Chase who hung himself in his door. And it could have been your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter, or your friend. It could have been one of us. So I know, I only came out in March this year. After 10 years after I first told my parents that I thought I was gay. And in those 10 years, I lost a lot of opportunities to make a difference. I was a high school teacher, and every day I wasn't out was a day I deprived the gay student of a positive role model. And I'm not willing to waste any more time. I have to act now. We have to act now. Because it isn't enough to let these things happen and then mourn them afterwards. We need to catch these kids before they jump. And there is something we can do to help as a start. Journalist Dan Savage has started a campaign, the It Gets Better campaign, to send messages of hope to teenagers who are being bullied because they're gay or for whatever reason, that they should have hope for their future, that they do have something to live for. And I think that if we made such a video, as Harvard students with glittering careers ahead of us and sparkling degrees, then we could make a difference. So we need people to hold a camera, to share their stories, to do editing and sound, to stand in a big group and say it gets better. No contribution is too small. And if you want to get involved and you're an undergraduate, talk to Tevin here. Do you mind waving? No. And he'll tell you how to get involved. And if you're a graduate student or if you just want to come along from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Elliott Lyman Room in Longfellow Hall at the Education Schools campus, stand up and say, we're standing with these kids. We've got your back. Let's catch them before they jump. Thank you.
So this was 5 minutes. I just want to emphasize. One of the things we learn in storytelling is brevity, is to substitute images for adjectives. because the power of the story, it depends on visualization. Being able to see it is what really enables it to see it, to hear it. That kind of sensory reality is what brings it alive. And so it means you can use less words. But what's he starting with? A story of self, story of us, or story of now? At the very beginning, what is it? Come on, speak up.
Self, his own experience.
At the very beginning, is that a now moment? Is it a self moment or an us moment?
Self.
I think
At the
it's a
very
now.
beginning.
I think
Huh?
it's a,
What?
I think it's a now.
Yeah, I think
Why?
it's now, too.
Why?
Just because he's raising the urgency. I mean, it could be an us, like, talking about supporting gay youth, but I think because he's focusing on, like, people are killing themselves every day, he's saying, don't wait another minute.
It's the disruption. That's the disruption, is that death, that's 604 seconds.
Exactly. You could get up there and say, well, let me give you the statistics on gay suicide among youth. Fine. No, here's this kid jumped off this bridge. This is how many seconds it took for him to fall. Imagine that. That's a now. That's a now moment. That's a confrontation with a kind of urgency. And so then he goes there. What's the next moment he goes to, though? Next moment. Remember? Anybody?
I thought it was a ballet.
Yeah, so why is he telling us about ballet?
That's his story.
Oh.
What do you mean it's his story?
His self.
Yeah.
That
But-
he experienced what those suicide kids that commit suicide experience.
When he's talking about ballet, what's the sense you get of him as a person? What do you feel?
He's establishing an emotional connection with his younger self, with us and the audience. Yeah, we're imagining I imagine my daughter in ballet class, and
there's joy in it, right? There's joy, there's celebration. See, he's not going to be the iconic victim. He's going to be a human being who's capable of joy, now, of course, there's an edge to it, right? But we get the sense of this person who is, living life in a joyful way. What's the next moment?
Principle. Talk about
before the principle. Before the principle.
bullying.
Yeah, by
his teacher.
the gym teacher, right? Is that here or is that there?
No, it's mine.
Okay. No, yeah, the gym teacher, right? And you hear what the gym teacher says to him. Now, how does it make you feel when you hear that?
Not happy.
Yeah, maybe even a little angry.
Yeah.
So now we're beginning to get a sense of why he might care about this thing. So then there's the third moment. What's the third moment? Third moment.
I think he transitions by saying we may not have all experienced this, but you may have been too tall or too short or the wrong race, or right.
So that's a transition to what?
Us.
Yeah, the third moment, he begins with a self where he talks about being all alone in the auditorium with no one on his, to back him up. And so that's another moment of self. But then now he's trying to figure out, okay, everybody hasn't experienced this, but in what way can I tap into people, to experience people have had, to begin to create some common kind of experience, to create some sorts of values. So he's taking something that could be a very narrow issue and making it as broadly accessible as he can, because the experience of a story occurs at the intersection of what we're told and what we remember. And so he's calling up our memories of the, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. So now he's moving toward a story of us, an experiential us. So when he's got us, where does he take us? When he's got us, where does he take us?
To the feeling of isolation.
He moves us past that quick to a call to action too.
Where does he, not yet. Think about images.
Examples, I think. So he He had the first one talking about Tyler Clementi, and then I thought after he talked about himself and then his isolation and the principal, you know, saying pray for homosexuals, and then everyone is in that, you know, everyone has something where people are, you know, bullying them. But then doesn't he go back to a few more examples of the kids who hung themselves, like back to the now?
How about it? See, then he takes us to another now moment. He takes us to the trees, right? Now, he doesn't take us to data points, does he?
Mm-hmm.
These aren't data points. These human beings, they have names, they have family. And there they are hanging from these trees. Now, in American culture, does that image raise any other connections? What?
Lynching.
Yeah. You know the song Billie Holiday recorded, Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood at the leaf, blood at the root, black body swinging in the southern breeze, scent of magnolia in the poplar trees. So what he's done, he's taken an injustice image. He didn't have to say injustice. What he did was present the image of the trees. And we begin to feel it. We begin to get it because it's part of a broader meta-narratives that are out there that we're all part of and living. So then, where does he go?
About his lost opportunity as a teacher. Talks
Where?
about his lost opportunity as a teacher.
Yeah.
His lost sense of time. Right.
Exactly. And the question, no, go ahead, Kathy.
And his sense of now, of urgency of now, of that he's inviting people to join him in the action of now.
You know, think about this. I mean, here he is, and he's acting in a leadership role. So leaders are supposed to be perfect, right? They're not supposed to make mistakes. They're not supposed to be vulnerable, are they? I mean, you know, I'm perfect, so just follow me and be perfect. Not so much. I mean, he's establishing that he failed. He could have acted, but he didn't. Now, why is that so important to do?
With the emotion, he talked about his fundamental humanness, that he's in formation.
Right.
Well, and because he's speaking to a group of people who have also failed to act.
Like all human beings, right?
And reminding us that it's never too late to act.
Exactly. See, there hasn't been much hope in this story at all up to this point. Not much. There's hope here. Where's the hope? Where is it? Out there in space somewhere? Where's the hope?
Coming together as a collective.
Well, and the hope is right there in the speaker because he has made the change, so we can make the change. And so that's kind of where we get the hope here that, oh yeah, maybe we could. And then he goes to the story of to the ask, to the and here's a possible pathway to action. And the significance of that is like Al Gore's movie, at the end of Inconvenient Truth, there's like 43 things you could do. And you know, people say, we have to give lots of choices. What it does is trivialize every single one. And we don't do any of them. And so leadership and organizing requires some strategic responsibility to have done the strategic work to sort of say, oh, here is a plausible pathway to action, should you choose to take it.
Marshall, can I ask you a quick, because I'm intrigued by this idea of that it's hopeful because he made the change.
Yeah.
I'm curious of, does it matter that he didn't say how he made the change? He just said a change happened.
Well, you're sharp. That's the missing piece. That's exactly right. That's the missing piece because he did, and he said, and I just, then I came out. It was 10 years since I came out to my parents, and you wonder, well, wait a second, what happened there? That's a critique, and it's a good critique of the story because, yeah, we're naturally curious. Well, what happened? Did you fall off a horse and have an epiphany, or what? Somebody come into your life? And no, it's an excellent question, and that would make it stronger.
Wouldn't that have been why he made the change, not necessarily how he made the change?
It's a little mixed up together because clearly something happened that it's not like, oh, all of a sudden, now I'm different. So no, Kathy, you'd be a good coach for this, really. It's very, very sharp. No, it's a really good question. And so this process, this linking of self, us, now, it's not a formula. If you listen to Barack Obama's Democratic Convention speech in 2004, in the first 7 minutes, you will hear self, us, now. James does it differently. He starts with a now and then goes to a self and then goes to an us and back to a self. The point is, it's more of a framework than it is a formula. But the thing about this is that we all have these stories. And see, the thing about it, we all tell stories. So this isn't teaching people something they don't already know how to do. We all know how to do this. It's the question of taking what's implicit, making it explicit, so that we can bring intentionality and craft and skill to this critically important form of communication. The first year I taught this, somebody said, oh, I see, this is how we can package ourselves. This is how we, and a woman from India, Jyoti Ravi, she said, this is not about how to apply a gloss from the outside. It's how to bring out the glow from the inside. And she had it exactly right. Authenticity merits skill and craft in order to realize its full power and potential. So this is just an example. Now, if we were in a class, I would call on one of you right now and we'd get to hear your story, but we don't have time for that, so you're safe. But no, it's...
Mark, I have one quick question. Was he one of your students?
Who?
The speaker.
Yeah. This was his midway exercise. He'd been in 5 weeks of class.
Nice.
But we do these workshops in a day. We're doing one tomorrow at the Divinity School with 25 students, and we'll take them through self, us, now, and then linking. And then the next day they come back and hear each other's stories. And it's incredibly powerful because overnight the learning is unbelievable. It's like, I think the Zygarnik effect, like when your brain is still working on something, it continues to work overnight. And we do this with the EDLD program at the Ed School, the Leadership and Education program. Each cohort is about 25. And we start off the semester with this workshop. And again, they all come back the next day and hear their 5-minute stories. And it's powerfully trust building. And, it's just interesting, this thing about vulnerability, because you don't get credit for courage without vulnerability. It's sort of, they're so interdependent. But if we don't allow ourselves to be seen, then we're not opening up to have relationships with anybody. And this is relational. Another group we've been working with is mayors. We've been working with 40 mayors a year. And we take them through a one-day workshop. They're from the US and 10 from outside. And then several have invited our team to go to their cities and do a workshop with community leaders. That's how we actually met Mayor Pete 3 years ago, because he was in our workshop. And our team went to South Bend and they did a workshop with community leaders. But we've also done Phoenix, we've done Sioux Falls. I mean, anybody who's trying to engage in relational work that's actually grounded in real stuff and not hung up on messaging and all that stuff, this is a useful tool.
Yeah. Let me pause there for a second, partly in the interest of time. I think we can all clap if we want to clap now. We can thank Marshall. It's been a real treat. So Marshall, I have one question in terms of follow-up. I gave some people some links onto your webpage, your personal one with links to some of the courses. Maybe when we're off of this line, you can make some other suggestions around how people might access some of the resources you already have available, the network that you've been part of starting and restarting. But yes. I think that people will be interested in a follow-up, I guess is the point. So you can guide us.
We'd love to make those resources available. I mean, because we have sort of a network of people who do this kind of coaching and training in a lot of different venues, but we also have a lot of online stuff. We're teaching an online class in public narrative right now with about 100 students and they're from about 20 countries. It's a really cool venue. We're using Zoom. We do an online class in organizing in the fall also. but we did a project for the resistance school. The students organized here at the Kennedy School after Trump was elected. And there's a module on public narrative that includes how to coach. Because when we teach this, when we teach students, we teach them to coach as well as to tell. In other words, they learn how to coach each other's stories as well as tell their story. And that turns out to be really valuable because they experience not just personal empowerment, but they experience the capacity to empower each other. And so it's a very important dimension of this. But look, we're happy to share whatever would be useful, helpful.
Well, that's real. I feel like I'm in a community of master teachers, and it's nice to have you join us and share some of your what you've learned. You know, we're kind of at our time. We kind of knew this would happen probably, that we would maximize Marshall's time and minimize the time to do some sharing. Normally, what we would do at this point, just to pull up the agenda just real quick, is we would talk for a second about sort of updates on different campuses, whether that's you as an individual doing something. I know Miriam's working with a group of colleagues to bring social action courses to a number of other departments and courses so that every semester somebody's teaching. There's also some updates on various campaigns. I know Scott's students with the student homelessness campaign have made some progress. Part of what we have to figure out as a group is ways we can do some of that sharing offline, you know, with updates with the listserv, this Bono learning community we're experimenting with. So what I'll do right here, if it's okay with everybody, is take one or two just quick updates, but otherwise I'll send out a request for you to actually send an email to that our listserv, and we'll pose some of these very questions that I'm posing now. But if there's one or two right now, people just want to share real quick, that would be great, and then we'll end for the day.
I think you have to cold call this, Craig.
Yeah, I think I might have to. Miriam, just tell us real quick about what you're doing with your faculty.
Oh, okay. So Janet is here. Janet Gray, one right there. So I would say we're still in the first semester of it, but it's been, we have a group of 4 really dedicated people. Janet's been an inspiration to me for years. I feel like she knows a lot of this stuff already, even though she's very self-deprecating and always says she doesn't. But she's been teaching ecofeminism in a kind of social action way, and they started a campus garden a couple years ago out of that class. So she'll be teaching ecofeminism again, a social action course, and then we have a psychology professor who's teaching, he's a social psychologist, and he's going to be teaching a course. I think it's like open to any social justice issue. And then we have another faculty member. I'll teach my climate change and society course again next fall, and then she'll teach it's basically like sustainability. I think it's called Sustainability in Society. So it's kind of between social justice and environmental justice frameworks.
Great. I'm gonna, does somebody else have a campaign their students are working on right now? They just want to share a quick story on that? All right, Scott, tell us because I was going to call on you and nobody else did.
Well, what I realize is I'm going to in the next edition of Social or Change is I'm going to have to write a whole section on the target, the meeting with the target. And usually in the campaigns I've been involved with, the students shake up the target so badly, they basically just give in to the demands. But what's happened with this campaign around the Student Homeless Alliance, and because it's such a complex question, it's been a series of negotiations with the administration, with the students. So it's just been a fascinating month, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at any of that press, but the students, they went to the press after it was released that the administration had only given 6 beds out of 100 that were requested. And so that there was so much pressure on them. They said, okay, we will negotiate with the students. And in the meantime, while we're in this, we've met now twice. We'll meet again on Monday. with extensive negotiations about what is going to be in the plan, and the students actually writing the plan, because the administration has been, I don't want to be too harsh on them, but they have not been very proactive. So the students really writing the plan. And don't say that that's between you and me and the TV who's going to be, the recording. But the students have really been the proactive ones guiding the plan. And then in the meantime, we have the mayor coming in with it's Airbnb proposal, and another supervisor coming in, all trying to jump into the pot. And we have been on the down low with the students, so they're keep on coming to the students asking what do they think of these ideas, and they're trying to say very little because they don't want to upset what they're trying to do with the administration. And just so you know, Marshall, Cindy Chavez, Supervisor Chavez, who you trained as a young 23-year-old, she has been the guiding light, trying to work with the administration to get them to do the right thing, but now meeting twice with the students, helping prepare them as they go into battle with the administration. So it's this collective effort of kind of the highest level of leadership in our county of Silicon Valley, trying to help the students negotiate this. It's going to be a monumental deal when it gets announced about what San Jose State's going to do, because it's so much attention's been drawn to it. So that has to be all written down at some point, because if you look in the book, there's probably like a paragraph on meeting with the target, and then kind of like this negotiation with the target, because usually the target just collapses, but this is not the case on a complex question around housing. So that's going on in a nutshell. It's been quite interesting.
Well, that's great, and we're not that far over. So I wish everybody a great weekend. We're gonna set the date for the next one. I'm tentatively scheduling it for December 13th, so a month from now, 3:30, same time. We'll record them. We'll keep recording them and make them available. We have this new Bono Learning Community platform we're experimenting with. We'll invite you guys again to join that, to continue the conversation. Marshall, again, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to thank Scott for starting this whole thing, and Bobby for your support, and everybody for this opportunity to learn together. And I hope it's just the beginning. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right. Be well, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Miriam. Bye, Kathy. Bye, Sean.